One of your first post-installation tasks for SCCM will be to define boundaries and boundary groups. Boundaries are network locations on your internal networks containing devices that you wish to manage. Boundary groups, on the other hand, are containers for boundaries, and we associate site system roles, the most common one being distribution points, with a boundary group. So any boundaries that are contained within that boundary group will then use those distribution points for content delivery. Let's head over to the whiteboard and take a quick look at an example, and then we'll jump into the virtual lab and configure boundaries and boundary groups for our environment. Let's say that we have 3 locations with our primary site hosted here at HQ. Maybe we have branch office 1 down here and branch office 2 down here. And these branch offices host their own distribution points. Now we've configured it this way so devices in those branch offices can download content from their local distribution point without needing to traverse the slow network link to HQ. This is where boundaries and, more importantly, boundary groups come into play. Remember, a boundary is nothing more than a network location. So let's say, for example, that we sliced up our network into subnets based on the departments in these buildings, or maybe the number of floors in these buildings. So HQ has 3 floors. Floor 1 is 192.168.1/24. Floor 2 is .2/24, and floor 3 is /3.24. And then in our branch office locations, maybe we have 2 floors, so we have subnets for each floor down there as well. Now, boundaries by themselves don't really do much for us, right? We're just defining our logical network segments within Configuration Manager. Boundary groups are where things begin to sizzle, because what we do is associate these boundaries with a boundary group, and then we associate site system servers containing specific site system roles, again, distribution points, management points, software update points, and even state migration points with that boundary group. So any devices associated with those boundaries will use those services associated with that boundary group. This will ensure that those branch office locations will use the services associated with their boundary groups. In this case, it's going to use those local distribution points rather than traversing the wire to get content from HQ. Another nice feature of boundary groups is known as automatic site assignment. This is something that we enable on the boundary group and then associate a primary site with that boundary group, and any new devices that come up within those associated boundaries will get automatically assigned to the primary site that we configured for that boundary group. And by the way, we will look at manual site assignment a little further down the road when we get to the client side of SCCM. Now let's head into the virtual lab and look at how to create and configure both boundaries and boundary groups. Here we are on SCCM NUG, and let's begin by getting right in to the Configuration Manager console. Once that console fires up, we're going to head down in the left-hand nav to Administration. From here, we're going to expand Hierarchy Configuration, and here is where we define our boundaries, and below that is where we define our boundary groups. So let's start here with boundaries. I'm going to right-click and choose to create a boundary. First up, we need to give it a name here, and a common practice is to use CIDR notation to define that segment of the network. So I'll use 192.168.1.0/24 as the name. And then we have 4 different types that we can use to define this boundary. The most common and recommended is an IP subnet, where we just specify our network and our subnet mask. We can also pull everything out of Active Directory sites and services. This is only recommended if you keep it up to date, and this will just pull all the subnets or even supernets out of there to define this boundary. IPv6, not quite there yet. An IP address range is really only used to define supernets and if you have thousands and thousands of boundaries that you need to slice up. So again here, IP subnet by far the most popular, and we'll go ahead and define it, 192.168.1.0 and 255.255.255.0 for the subnet mask, and that'll pull in the subnet ID automatically. You can also then, if you have already created your boundary groups, associate this boundary with the boundary group from here. We haven't created those yet, so we'll do that separately, but that's it. We've now defined our first boundary. Now, I went ahead and created these other 2 boundary groups for the .2 and .3/24 networks, even though they won't be used because our virtual lab environment, we only have this one network segment, but it won't hurt or anything having these in here. Now let's create a boundary group that will contain those 3 boundaries. If we head down to boundary groups, you'll notice that there is a default site boundary group already created. It pulled that in here from Active Directory, and this is generally used for fallback. More on that in the future, but for now we're going to create our own boundary group here. So we'll right click, choose create boundary group. We'll give this one a name. I called mine BG-Nug, and now we can add those boundaries into this boundary group. So we can hit the add button here, and we'll add them all in and associate them with this BG. From here we can head up to the References tab, and this is where we configure automatic site assignment, and we can also specify those site system servers containing those services, management points, distribution points, state migration points, and software update points that any device within those boundaries will then be associated with through this boundary group. So we'll start here by configuring automatic site assignment, and since we only have one site, it'll automatically be selected there for us. And now we can hit add, and this will list all of the site system servers that contain any of those site system roles that we just talked about. And we've only got one here, so we can check this, hit OK, and hit OK, and we're good to go. One more thing I want to show you here is if we head back into the properties of our newly created boundary group, we get a few more tabs to play with. Relationships and security. Security is pretty self-explanatory. Relationships is pretty cool. This is how we can configure fallback to other boundary groups. So we can specify another boundary group here. We only have one. It's that default one. And then we can specify the amount of time that must elapse for each one of these services. And if that time is hit, that means those services are probably unavailable for this boundary group, and it will fall back and use the services of the boundary group that we define here. So if we hit OK and accept the defaults, there we go. So if any of the services in this boundary group become unavailable, all of our devices will then get pointed to the services in this fallback boundary group. In the CBT Nugget, we defined what boundary and boundary groups are, what they can do for us, and how to create and configure them in the virtual lab. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.